Nobody told Ray Charles the rules of the music business. They didn't need to. He learned them the hard way. Through contracts that took everything and gave back almost nothing, through handshake deals that evaporated the moment they became inconvenient, through a system designed to extract maximum value from young black talent while returning minimum control, minimum credit, and minimum money to the people whose gifts made the whole enterprise possible. He was 17 years old when he arrived in Seattle with $7 in his pocket. He was not naive. He had grown up in poverty in rural Florida, had lost his sight at 7, had lost his mother at 15, had navigated a world that offered almost no structural support to a blind black boy from the rural South. He knew that the world was not arranged in his favor. He knew that fairness was not a feature of the systems he would have to move through. What he did not yet know, what he spent the next 17 years learning, slowly and at considerable personal cost, was exactly how the music industry worked, where its pressure points were, and how a man with the right knowledge and the right stubbornness might eventually use its own architecture against it. This is that story. Not the story of the hits, though the hits came. Not the story of the fame, though the fame arrived in waves. This is the story of the years before all of that. The bodega gigs and the predatory contracts and the boarding house rooms and the slow, grinding accumulation of knowledge that Ray Charles turned, eventually into something no one in the music business had seen a black artist do before. This is the story of how Ray Charles learned the game, and then changed it to parto. Startier and Tikoff Takanafar Mamnachain. Ray Charles arrived in Seattle in 1947 with a specific plan, or as specific a plan as a 17-year-old with $7 could construct. He had the name of a musician acquaintance, Gossie McKee, who had worked the Pacific Northwest circuit and knew which clubs hired and which ones paid. Ray had chosen Seattle deliberately, almost geographically. It was the farthest point in the continental United States from Florida, from the grave of his mother Aretha Robinson, from every version of himself that had ended in loss. The Pacific Northwest music scene of the late 1940s was small, competitive, and racially complex in ways that differed from the South, but were not without their own hierarchies and exclusions. Black musicians worked the same circuit as white musicians in some venues and were rigidly excluded in others. The clubs that welcomed black performers often paid less, booked on shorter notice, and reserved the right to cancel without compensation. Ray Charles learned all of this quickly because he had to. His first weeks in Seattle were a study in the practical mathematics of survival. What a rooming house cost per week, what the minimum acceptable fee for a club date was, how to negotiate without appearing to negotiate, how to read a booker's hesitation and know whether it was about money or about something that money couldn't fix. He formed a trio, the Maxon Trio, later known as the Maxon Trio, with Gossie McKee and bassist Milton Guard. They worked the clubs steadily enough to stay housed and fed, which was the operational definition of success at that stage. Ray played piano, sang, arranged the material, and watched. He watched how the club owners operated, how the booking agents positioned their acts, how contracts were structured, which clauses protected the venue, and which clauses protected nobody except the venue. He was 17 years old, completely blind, 3,000 miles from everything he had ever known, and he was taking notes. Not literal notes. Ray Charles had developed out of absolute necessity a memory system of extraordinary precision. He had been reading music in Braille since the Florida School for the Deaf and Blind, composing and retaining entire arrangements without the ability to write them down in any conventional sense. The same cognitive architecture that let him hold an orchestral arrangement in his head let him hold the terms of a conversation, the specific language of a verbal agreement, the exact number a booker had offered 3 weeks ago before trying to revise it downward tonight. He forgot nothing. This was not a talent. It was a survival mechanism that had been built by years of navigating a world without the visual cues that sighted people use to orient themselves, to read situations, to know when something is being misrepresented. Ray Charles had developed, in place of those visual cues, an exceptionally fine-grained sensitivity to language, to what words meant, to what words were doing, to the gap between what someone said and what they intended. In a business built substantially on the exploitation of that gap, this sensitivity was worth more than almost anything else he possessed. But knowledge alone was not enough. Not yet. He was still young, still unknown outside a small regional circuit, still entirely dependent on the goodwill of people who had no structural incentive to treat him fairly. The knowledge was accumulating. The leverage had not yet arrived. That would take time, and it would take a move that most people in his position would have considered too risky to attempt. To Parvwlanti an high Idrael Amanti in 1952, Ray Charles signed with Atlantic Records. From the outside, this looked like a young artist getting his break. Atlantic was a small but respected independent label run by Ahmet Erdogan and Herb Abramson, men who had genuine love for black music and a reputation, relative to the industry standard, for treating their artists with something approaching fairness. The signing was covered in the trade press as a promising development for a talented young performer. What the trade press did not cover, what was not visible from the outside, was the specific terms of the negotiation and what Ray Charles had and had not accepted. Ray Charles entered the Atlantic negotiation having spent 5 years learning exactly what the standard industry contract looked like and exactly which elements of that contract he most objected to. The standard deal of the era was constructed entirely in the label's favor. The label owned the master recordings, the label controlled distribution, the label set the royalty rate, and the artist had little to no recourse if any of those arrangements proved disadvantageous. Artists were, in the language that would later be used to describe these arrangements, effectively tenant farmers on their own creative output, working the land, delivering the harvest, receiving a percentage that the landowner determined. Ray Charles understood this structure completely by 1952. He had seen it operate on other musicians, he had watched careers be built and then effectively owned by the companies that had built them. He had observed with his particular quality of attention what happened to artists who signed without reading and to artists who pushed back on terms and to artists who tried to renegotiate from positions of weakness. He signed with Atlantic, but he negotiated. He pushed on specific clauses. He did not win everything. He was not yet in a position to win everything, but he established, in the process of negotiating, a relationship with Erdogan and the label that was different from the standard artist label dynamic. He was not simply talent to be deployed. He was a man who understood what he was signing and intended to hold the other party to it. The records he made at Atlantic between 1952 and 1959 were extraordinary. I Got a Woman, Hallelujah, I Love Her So, What I Say, the recordings that invented soul music, that fused gospel and rhythm and blues in ways that no one had tried before, that established Ray Charles as one of the most significant artists in American popular music. The commercial success was real and growing. The artistic achievement was undeniable. But with each successful record, Ray Charles was also doing something else. He was watching the money. He was tracking the royalties. He was understanding with increasing precision exactly how the economics of a hit record worked, who got paid how much at what stage, and where the leverage in that chain actually resided. And by 1959, he had identified something that changed his calculations entirely. The masters shit in the music industry of the late 1950s. The concept of master recording ownership was not a topic of widespread public discussion. It was understood within the industry, by label executives, by lawyers, by the business side of the operation, but it was rarely explained to artists in the direct, consequential terms that would have made its significance clear. The master recording of a song is the original, definitive recording from which all copies are made. The entity that owns the master controls the song's commercial future, how it is licensed, where it is distributed, what it costs to use, whether it can be re-released, remixed, included in compilations, or sold to another company. Master ownership is, in practical terms, the ownership of the recorded work itself, not just the right to sell it now, but the right to determine its fate indefinitely. Atlantic Records owned the masters of every recording Ray Charles had made for them. This was standard. This was how every major and most independent labels operated. Artists made records. Labels owned the records. Artists received royalties from the sale of records, a percentage of the commercial value of something they no longer controlled. Ray Charles had understood this intellectually for years. What changed in 1959 was that he understood it operationally, understood it in terms of what it meant for his specific situation, his specific catalog, his specific future. His ABC-Paramount offer arrived at precisely this moment of understanding. ABC-Paramount was a larger label with more distribution muscle than Atlantic. The financial terms they offered were substantially better than what Atlantic was paying. But what made the ABC-Paramount offer transformative, what made it different from simply moving to a bigger label for more money, was a single clause that Ray Charles had negotiated into the deal himself. Through his lawyer and through his own direct involvement in the negotiation, ABC-Paramount would allow Ray Charles to own his own masters. Not lease them back after a period. Not share ownership on a split basis. Own them. The recordings he made for ABC-Paramount would belong to Ray Charles. The label would distribute and promote the records and receive their share of the revenue from sales, but the recordings themselves, the actual, definitive versions of the music, would be his property. This had essentially never happened before for a black artist at a major American label. When the news reached Atlantic, Ahmet Ertegun's response mixed genuine hurt with something that resembled disbelief. He felt the departure as a personal betrayal. He had believed in Ray Charles when others hadn't, had given him the platform on which the breakthrough had happened. And that was true. It was also true, and Ray Charles knew it, that Atlantic's belief in him had been expressed through a contract that gave Atlantic ownership of everything Ray Charles had created during the most formative years of his artistic life. The two things were simultaneously true. and Ray Charles had decided which one was more important. Part for you are. The FXPT. The conventional wisdom in the music business of 1959 was that Ray Charles had made a mistake. Not because ABC-Paramount was a bad label, they were a legitimate operation with real commercial muscle, but because the accepted understanding was that artists needed labels more than labels needed artists. The infrastructure of recording, manufacturing, distribution, and promotion was vast, expensive, and entirely controlled by the corporate side of the industry. An artist who antagonized the label system, who pushed too hard on terms, who insisted on arrangements that made the artist more powerful relative to the label, was an artist who would find the system less cooperative, less promotional, less enthusiastic in ways that were difficult to prove but very real in their effects. Ray Charles was expected in some quarters to be taught a lesson. Instead, what happened in the first 3 years of his ABC-Paramount tenure was Modern Sounds in Country and Western Music. Released in 1962, the album was, among other things, a demonstration of what an artist with genuine creative control could do when the label relationship was structured differently. Ray Charles had proposed the project himself, a black artist recording country music, drawing on the white Southern musical tradition that had been part of his sonic landscape since childhood, presented with full orchestral arrangements and the full commitment of his voice and interpretive intelligence. ABC-Paramount was uncertain. The format was unprecedented. The commercial risks seemed real. Ray Charles made the album. He owned the masters. He had built into his contract the kind of creative latitude that his Atlantic deal had not provided. Modern Sounds in Country and Western Music spent 14 weeks at #1 on the pop album charts. It became one of the best-selling records of 1962. It demonstrated, as clearly as any single commercial event could, that Ray Charles's judgment about his own artistic direction was worth trusting, and that the contract structure that allowed him to exercise that judgment produced better results than the structure that had constrained it. The music industry took note, not immediately, not all at once, not in ways that translated quickly into changed standard practices, but the note was taken. Tu parta feigen. Te long edukio and itbl. The 17 years between Ray Charles's arrival in Seattle and the ABC-Paramount deal were not simply a period of artistic development. Though they were certainly that, they were a sustained, self-directed education in the mechanics of an industry that had been designed to benefit from the ignorance of the people whose creativity powered it. Ray Charles was not the only black artist of his era who understood that the system was exploitative. He was not the only one who resented the standard contract terms, the ownership structures, the royalty arrangements that kept artists economically dependent on the entities that controlled their work. Many of his contemporaries understood the problem with comparable clarity. What distinguished Ray Charles was what he did with that understanding. He did not simply resent the system. He studied it. He memorized its terms and its mechanisms and its pressure points. He identified the specific element, master ownership, that represented the most fundamental lever of control, and he made obtaining that element the non-negotiable condition of any deal he was willing to sign. He built something that outlasted the contracts, that outlasted the labels, that outlasted the commercial arrangements and the industry relationships and the specific deals that had defined his early career. He built a body of work that belonged to him, that he could control, license, pass on, protect, because he had understood, before almost anyone else in his position had understood it, that in the music business, ownership was not just an economic condition. It was the difference between legacy and exploitation. The artists who came after Ray Charles, who negotiated harder, who demanded more, who eventually built the kind of artist, owned structures that are now commonplace in the industry, built on a foundation that Ray Charles had helped establish, not through speeches or public advocacy, but through the quiet, relentless application of knowledge to contract negotiations one clause at a time, over 17 years of rooms that no one important was watching. He had arrived in Seattle at 17 with $7 and the name of a musician acquaintance. He had left the city of those early years knowing things about the music industry that most artists twice his age had never learned. And he had used that knowledge, steadily and patiently and with the particular stubbornness of a man who had learned very early that no one was going to arrange the world fairly on his behalf, to build something that the system had never intended him to have. Not just a career, not just a catalog control, complete documented, legally enforceable control over the work of his own hands and voice and mind. The parta si ekita oduunuarki. Ray Charles died on June 10, 2004. He left behind not just a musical legacy but an estate, a collection of master recordings, publishing rights, and intellectual property that had real, substantial documented value. His children inherited not just his name and his memory but the actual recordings themselves. The ability to determine how Georgia on My Mind was used, how what I say was licensed, how the entire body of work he had created was deployed in the world going forward. This was not accidental. This was the result of decisions made in boarding house rooms in Seattle in 1948, in contract negotiations in New York in 1952 and 1959, in every conversation where Ray Charles had pushed back on a term that would have transferred his ownership to someone else. In the decades after his death, as the question of artist ownership became one of the central debates in the music industry. As streaming changed the economics of recorded music, as artists began publicly fighting to reclaim masters they had signed away in youth, as the language of creative ownership entered mainstream public conversation, Ray Charles stood as an early and largely unheralded example of what was possible when an artist had the knowledge and the will to insist on it. He had not waited for the industry to become fair. He had not trusted that the people across the negotiating table had his interests at heart. He had learned the rules of a system designed to exploit him and had used those rules, carefully and precisely, to protect himself from the exploitation. This was not a romantic story. There was nothing glamorous about spending 17 years in small rooms learning contract law while also trying to make great music. There was nothing celebrated at the time about the specific terms of the ABC-Paramount deal or the master ownership clause that Ray Charles had insisted upon. These were quiet, technical, unglamorous victories, the kind that don't make headlines but determine the shape of a life. But they were the foundation of everything else. The hits, the fame, the Grammys, the cultural legacy, all of it rested on the fact that Ray Charles had refused, at a fundamental level, to let the music business own him. Had refused the deal that said, "We will make you famous, and in exchange you will give us your work forever." He had taken the fame, and he had kept the work. To eplogue, t loch t deus to rlrnentoslbly. There's a particular kind of intelligence that does not announce itself. That does not arrive with credentials or titles or institutional validation. That builds itself quietly from necessity and observation and the refusal to accept ignorance as a permanent condition. Ray Charles had that intelligence. He had developed it in the dark, literally in the dark, from the age of 7, learning to navigate a world that had not been designed with him in mind. He had refined it through years of club dates and small time contracts and the 1,000 minor transactions of an early career in a business that assumed he would not read the fine print. He read the fine print, he remembered every word of it, and when the moment came, when the leverage arrived, when the offer was on the table that contained the clause he had been working toward for 17 years, he knew exactly what he was looking at and exactly what it was worth. The music he made was extraordinary. The voice was one of the great instruments of the 20th century. The songs he chose, arranged, performed, and recorded belonged to the permanent record of American art. But the work that made the music possible, the unglamorous, uncelebrated, years-long work of understanding the system well enough to survive it on his own terms, that work deserves its own recognition. Not because it was heroic in any conventional sense, but because it was real and hard and done entirely without a map. Ray Charles arrived in Seattle at 17 with $7. He left the music industry decades later owning his own work. That distance from $7 and a borrowed name to the legal ownership of a body of art that will outlast every contract that tried to claim it is the distance a man travels when he decides, early and permanently, that no one else is going to protect what is his. He protected it himself, one clause at a time.